There's a lot of humor in the book. I don't know if I mentioned that. Like it sort of happened accidentally. First, I wrote the first draft of the book. It was how I intended, and then people were saying like, I don't recognize your personality. I started adding humor and humor. So the book is actually quite different from stylistically, I think, at least from most investment books. And I was actually quite surprised the impact that had on people's ability to also read the book. I had an idea for. I thought there was a missing practical book. Like there's a lot of good books on mental models on how to evaluate various aspects of quality and about like quality investing, even though I wouldn't say my book is about quality investing, but it's about evaluating quality. But I think a lot of them lack the kind of practical, what is the empirical determinants that you want to see, and I wanted to write a book about that. But then sort of accidentally it also became a book that is stylistically very different. This book is sort of more narrow focused. It focuses only on evaluating quality. And it doesn't mean that it's a book about quality investing. It's just a book about evaluating quality, and quality is an input to determining the value of something. And then because it's more narrow, it's also a little bit more focused and maybe a little bit more advanced.
Dear viewers of Good Investing Talks, it's great to have you back, and it's great to welcome Simon Kold. He's a book author, and he is about to release a very interesting book. It's called On the Hunt for Great Companies, an Investor's Guide to Evaluating Business Quality and Durability. So Simon, great to have you here.
Great to be here, Tillman. Thank you.
Great to have you. And today we want to talk about your book. But before we dive into the book, maybe let's add a bit of background around you. So who are you, and why are you qualified to teach someone with a book on the hunt for great companies?
Yeah, so I'm Danish. I worked 10 years at Novo Holdings, the investment arm of the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which is the world's largest private charitable foundation. But compared to, I think, like US foundations and so on, it's much more direct investments and much more private markets mindset. I have a little bit of an unconventional background into investing, in the sense that I also have a bachelor's degree in theology, and I used to do stand-up comedy here in the Copenhagen comedy scene 15, 16 years ago, that I sort of accidentally also bring to the book. I had an idea for, I thought there was a missing practical book. Like there's a lot of good books on mental models on how to evaluate various aspects of quality and about like quality investing, even though I wouldn't say my book is about quality investing, but it's about evaluating quality. But I think a lot of them lack the kind of practical, what is the empirical determinants that you want to see, and I wanted to write a book about that. But then sort of accidentally it also became a book that is stylistically very different. But that was not the plan in the beginning. The plan was to write this dry practical investment book, like almost like a textbook on how to evaluate business quality in investment analysis.
So your qualification from Novo Holdings is that you did a lot of investments into great companies there with their direct investment team?
Exactly. I think that is it's based on my practical experience from 10 years of investing, but it's also just based, I would say, on synthesis of everything I have read. Like all the books on specific aspects, all the academic research and so on that I have read in the stuff that I have tried to integrate in my work, I have tried to synthesize in this book. So I wouldn't say that every single word is derived from a particular transaction or something that I was directly involved in. It's just based on synthesis of information and my practical experience.
That's a great background for such a book. Who would be the ideal reader for your book?
So I think it has multiple kind of readers, but I think for sure, if you are young, you're into your investment career, maybe you are 1 to 5 to 10 years into your investment career, there will be a lot of stuff in this book that is sort of applicable in your day-to-day analysis. So I think that you will see the book having a sweet spot there. But then because of the stylistic aspects that is mentioned, I think the book will have a much broader reader base. I think it will be enjoyed by also very, very seasoned investors, who I know liked it from. I had 40 reviewers, but I think also actually people who are beginners or amateur investors, they will like it. I have these boxes with analytical steps you can take. And since they're in this box, you can actually just skip them. So if you are like a private, the sort of you're just an amateur investor, you're just interested in learning about it, you can just skip these boxes, and then the book is also very accessible to you. So I think it will have multiple kinds of audiences.
So maybe imagine a reader who bought the book before he started reading it and after reading it. What kind of transformation does the book do with someone when they read and study the book closely?
So I think what I saw, I had 40 different reviewers, and most of them are quite experienced investors. And what I saw the pattern that for some of the chapters, people kind of they understood the concept very well. They know it already. It's kind of known things like network effects or staying power or something, but maybe they hadn't thought really through how to test the durability and the intensity of a certain aspect. Maybe there were some, they each had like blind spots where they took away something. I don't think there was a single person who were like, I knew everything in this book. I don't think there were that. So, and then because it's sort of a unified framework for evaluating quality, it's also very tangible. Like you can just implement it you can basically, if you want, I mean, I'm not encouraging people to do it, to systematically go through this as an analytical model, because I think it might be a little bit too cumbersome for some people, but you can pinpoint down what's the most important aspects to your particular investment case you're working on, and then use it basically as a guide to say, okay, so these are the hypotheses I want to test. What is the specific information I need to look for to test it? So I think that's what people will take away. Of course, the less experienced you are, the less investment books you have read, the more novel everything in the book will be. But I think even for someone who has read like everything, I think there will be new things. In the appendix, there's also this. It's a different kind of checklist. It's kind of a list you can use to check your own investment hypothesis for sort of logical flaws, and I think that is probably the most original part of the book. That at least I haven't seen or heard anybody describe that before, and I think that is something that probably everybody can use.
So everybody should check out the appendix.
They should check out the whole thing. They should check out the whole thing.
But we are all a bit time constrained, and are there ways you would recommend to do if you want to read the book with a limited time? You already mentioned these boxes.
Well, I mean, these boxes is sort of the you could say the optional advanced version. So if that's not for you, you just sort of have a casual interest in investing, you just skip those and just read the book. Then I think it's a very enjoyable read. But if what you want is more like looking for the specific tools to analyze certain things, I think the boxes is where you have like the value for you. So I think it depends kind of who you are.
So if you want to read the book with a limited time and quite efficiently, go for the boxes or skip the boxes?
That depends on who you are. Right, depends on who you are, what you're after. So I have some of my friends who are non-investing friends who read the book. They actually understood the books, but I asked them, so did you skip the boxes? And they were like, yeah, I skipped the boxes. But then I have other people who are like really hardcore professional investors, and they liked that part. I mean, the book, there's a lot of humor in the book. I don't know if I mentioned that. Like it sort of happened accidentally. First, I wrote the first draft of the book. It was how I intended, and then people were saying like, I don't recognize your personality. I started adding humor. So the book is actually quite different from stylistically, I think, at least from most investment books. And I was actually quite surprised the impact that had on people's ability to also read the book. So people who are not investors, they can actually, I think because partly of the style, they actually get engaged by the book, but they get kind of turned off by these boxes, I think, because that's the thing, is this kind of bizarre combination between actually a pretty advanced investment book and then kind of comedic tricks. It's a kind of combination that doesn't make sense. But now I did it. So
you already mentioned that humor is an ingredient to make the book different. What else makes it different to other investing books?
So, well, I think if you stripped out the humor, I think it's still very different. I think you have some of the, there's a category of investing books that I would call like toolbox books that are very practical, very like not so much mental model, very much like this is kind of how you do it. Like, for example, Pat Dorsey's book, which is great, which I highly recommend. But I think this book is sort of more narrow focused. It focuses only on evaluating quality. And it doesn't mean that it's a book about quality investing. It's just a book about evaluating quality, and quality as an input to determining the value of something. And then because it's more narrow, it's also a little bit more focused and maybe a little bit more advanced. So I think that is where it stands out. I think there's, to my knowledge, that book doesn't exist today. But then, of course, then you add on that stylistic aspect, which makes it sort of like almost like freakish. I don't know. It wasn't my plan originally, as I mentioned. I mean, if I had wanted to actually write like the world's first comedy investing book or something, I would have probably approached it totally different. But anyway, now it's this way, and people seem to like it. So hey.
Okay, then prepare for a lot of humor when reading the book. So imagine a group of investors, and maybe let me ask the question based on this imagination: which investors might be slightly offended when reading the book?
Yeah, so since the book uses sort of satire a lot and sort of these, you could call them like exaggerated analogies, like you take an argument and then you kind of take it to the extreme in two contrasts, and I use that a lot. So of course there's some people who get sort of satirized along. I think the number one is probably the kind of very heuristic thinking. The people who are very like binary, like you have the very thinking you have cyclical industries and non-cyclical industries, and it's carved in stone. This is like God came down to earth and he said it's cyclical and non-cyclical. There's not a scale. Or people who think a lot in terms of like just heuristics, like ROIC or PE or ratios, and don't think qualitatively about stuff and go to the deeper level of determinants behind what is actually the leading determinants of durable high return on invested capital, instead of just what is the ratio I can pull up on Bloomberg, like and I kind of satirize them a little bit. And then of course I also satirize people who are just kind of lazy in terms of the analysis, who seek verification of the idea instead of seek falsification of the idea, right? And there's a lot of stuff that they get kind of grouped in, as I call them, dowsers. They look for water with a stick, or diviners. I have all these illustrations in there. So, but of course it's an exaggeration. If people get offended by it, they should be like, hey, I think we are all guilty of doing that from time to time. But I think it's just an effective way to get my point across.
It will be interesting what feedback you will get on the book outside of the sample you already have.
For sure, there will be some fundamentalists who will read the book very, very like the same way you have some people who read the book like a religious fundamentalist or something. But I mean, they are welcome to criticize me. I mean, if you can't take a little bit of humor, then maybe, I don't know.
What are 3 insights that I can get from the book that might surprise me as a reader?
It depends a little bit on you, Tillman, because I kind of don't know where your holes are in. So I think based on my experience from 40 reviewers, everybody had something different where they were like, hey, I hadn't thought about this before. So it's hard for me to pinpoint. Like, the concept of the book is not to present like one original idea and just go through it, the whole book, like for example, like in Checklist Manifesto or something. It's 17 different aspects of quality and how you empirically assess them. So if there were maybe 2 or 3 of those 17 that you had maybe not thought so much about the determinants of them, that would be the 2-3 things that I think you would take away. But for someone else, it might be something else.
So is there any pattern you've seen of surprises?
Well, I think the chapter on staying power, there's a chapter on staying power with the determinants of staying power. I think maybe you had like a little bit higher percentage of people who hadn't thought about that. There was also a lot of people who I think hadn't thought about some of the analytical methods to evaluate the reliability of people, of having simulated following the company for a long time. That I also, maybe there was a higher proportion of reviewers who hadn't thought about that.
So
if you want, I can explain it.
No, people should have a look at these chapters, I think, because I want to now talk about great companies. Great companies are in the title of your book. And maybe to open the book a bit for the reader, about which 5 companies can I learn the most when reading the book?
Yeah, so the book has a lot of company examples. There's like, I don't know how many there are, but there's, every time I mention something, I usually follow up with one example and kind of a counter example and jump back and forth between contemporary and old examples. I think Apple is probably the company that I used as an example most, probably followed by Berkshire. But then you ask for a top 5, it's difficult for me because there's just like different examples for different things. There's an example with ASML, there's an example with the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, there's an example with Saudi Aramco, there's an example with Standard Oil, there's examples of different companies from different times and with respect to different things. So it's difficult to say top 5, but at least I had to take some Apple stuff out because people said there's too much Apple. You used Apple as an example too many times. So I had to tone it down a little bit.
Then maybe let's take Berkshire and Apple. What makes them a great company?
Ooh, okay. So I think Apple is like, I just think Apple actually hits many of the examples. So if you look at, it would be difficult to go through all of them. But I think, okay, if we talk about passionate management, I think it hits, without going through actually all the determinants that are discussed in the book, but I would just say I think it hits many of them. It hits incentives pretty good. They have a very good track record of capital allocation. They bought back nearly half of the shares outstanding. Also at a time when the company was valued very, very low. There's a table in my book where I show all the predictions that Tim Cook has made on historical earnings calls and compare them to ex-post outcomes to kind of show how you can go back and simulate having followed a company as an input to assessing the reliability of what they say today. I think Apple has multiple kinds of interesting competitive advantages. It has switching cost multipliers. The more Apple products you own, the less inclined you are to switch. It has a brand that I actually think qualifies as a brand advantage, even though I'm actually quite skeptical of that. It has network effects. You have different kinds of network effects. You have a two-sided network effect on the App Store. You also have like ecosystem network effects. I think Apple has had great reinvestment options. You know, they could expand into adjacent product categories that were not only in themselves financially lucrative, but also actually increase the strength of the existing stuff they had. I think that you could debate whether they have been too value extractive. That's maybe a drawback where you could say maybe they have. The question is, have they extracted too much value as a percentage of the value that they created for developers, and also, I mean, to what extent have they used some of their pricing power? You could have a discussion around. Anyway, let's not go too much into it. But I think it should. But I guess it should be pretty clear to people who know a little bit about Apple. It's also a very well-known company that it's a great company. So I think Berkshire I mentioned is specifically with regard. So without going specifically into the underlying companies that Berkshire own, but I think the example where I mentioned Berkshire is in relation to internal diversification. So when you're a concentrated investor, like I am personally a very concentrated investor, right? I think it's a plus if you have some degrees of internal diversification, but you sometimes see companies that succeed in internal diversification, and then you see companies that don't succeed in internal diversification. You have some high efficient and some low efficient conglomerates. And I use Berkshire as an example to discuss and Lifco also some of what I view as some of the determinants of successful companies that are actually quite decentralized, but still have a lot of internal diversification. And also I think I also mentioned it in relation to, I make the argument that I don't necessarily view cyclical industries as a bad thing, but it requires, of course, that you are able that you're mentally prepared to act in a downturn. Like, for for instance, Michael O'Leary of Ryanair, but I think also Berkshire have shown to be not that their businesses are necessarily cyclical, or actually I don't think they are, but just the mindset of actually being conservative through the cycle and then being aggressive in the cyclical downturn.
Are you delivering with your book a general definition of a great company, or is it more that the book gives you a big checklist and screen list to find greatness?
But it's not meant to be a checklist, Tillman. It's not meant to be like, I think if you use this as a checklist, then you only end up with very few companies. So it's not meant to be a checklist. It's meant to be an analytical recipe for various aspects of quality, right? There will be very few companies that will hit all of these criteria. Very, very few. There will always be something where it's weak or where you can debate it. I think what you should try to do is invert a lot. Try to think about, for example, okay, so what are the competitive disadvantages that my target company has in relation to its direct or indirect competitors? Okay, so can I then use these recipes that I get from Simon's book to evaluate basically the advantages that the competitors might have over my company, for example, or focus on, okay, so already based on sort of high-level pattern recognition, I can see that these are the weak spots of this target company. So let me actually approach the determinants as described in this book and focus on that. I don't think it should be like it's not my intention that people should be using this as like a crazy mega checklist. That's not really the intention. But of course it could be used in that way. But I don't know. I don't think you need to actually follow through on everything. But it can work as a unified mental model also. So it's not only about empirical stuff and analytical stuff. Just all of these chapters and all of these determinants. If you kind of use them as a mental model, so actually not going in and doing all the stuff that I write about, but just that works as a great, I think, sort of framework for discussing overall quality as a mental model. So it can be used in that way as well.
In your personal research process, how long does it take for you to identify greatness at a company? So how many hours, days, weeks do you have to invest?
But I think actually there's something different. Like I think, so the book, I would separate identifying and evaluating, right? Actually identifying, I don't think is perhaps necessarily that difficult to identify stuff. You can identify some of these characteristics that you think are there, right? And you think this company might be great. That's actually not very difficult. But I think what is harder and what I think justifies this book is then, okay, so now I have a theory that this company is great. And that doesn't take a lot of time to figure out. That's basically just like pattern recognition. Now I want to test it. And I think I want to, and of course testing doesn't mean that you get to like, I proved it. That's not the point, right? It means, can I increase or reduce my conviction based on actual facts with regard to the relevant determinants of whatever I thought made the company great. And that I think is a little bit more difficult and can take time, but it depends on the case. So for example, if you talk about network effects, right? If it's a type of network effects that's sort of very local, you might have to go out and do work sort of area by area or in a sample of areas just to understand some of the dynamics. But if it's a global network effect, maybe it's so it kind of depends on the situation. What is required varies case by case. The point is not that you should be doing due diligence to death. That is totally not the point.
What can I or one get wrong when I try to identify and evaluate greatness?
Well, I think what you can for sure get wrong is that you see something. Let's just take an example. You see something that reminds you of something. So you use kind of subconsciously, you use kind of an argument of analogy. This company reminds me of this other thing I have seen. Therefore, it's great. it's kind of like the visa of this, or it's kind of like the, you know what I mean? Like that kind of logic you see a lot in kind of when people pitch a stock, they use these analogous arguments. It could also be that you rely too much on anecdotal evidence that is supportive of your own thesis. So you kind of subconsciously, even though you don't know it, you have actually just given more weight to the to some evidence that support your thesis. And I think by having a systematic approach to how you evaluate stuff is great. And I think that is what I try to do with the book.
Hey, Tilman here. It's great that you've made it that far into the video, and I think it shows a certain passion for investing you're having. If you want to dive deeper and go further down the rabbit hole, you're invited to apply to my community, Good Investing Plus. It's a place that's very helpful to people who are ambitious about investing. It's helpful to investment talent as well as experienced fund managers. So if you're interested, please click on the link below. And now, without further ado, enjoy the conversation. Have you identified any myths or misconceptions investors have about great companies or greatness in companies?
So so one thing I think is kind of interesting. If you go to like an investor event and you start discussing with people what's a great company, I think most people, they will kind of agree on the same thing. Well, you know, there need to be a competitive advantage. It's good if it's not too capital intensive. It's good if it's not too cyclical. It needs to have like a capable management. It needs to have high return on invested capital, and so on and so on and so on. But then when you look at their portfolios, they are always in totally different positions. And one guy, he's like, oh, how can you? So I think people, they give weight to different things. Like, for example, I'm personally probably a little bit more interested in emerging quality. So companies that are not obvious quality. They are not the they are not established quality where it's kind of so obvious to everybody that they are quality. It's more like at the intersection of quality and emerging quality. That's kind of just that's not about the book. That's just my personal sort of what I like. I like to have to depend on qualitative work to be able to determine it, and not just being able to rely on what is like extremely obvious and just heuristics like return on invested capital or margin stuff. I like to go a little bit deeper, but that's just a personal preference. I'm not saying that's better or worse. I think did I lose the question a little bit there?
No, it's about the myths and misconceptions, and you shared the bit.
Okay, so yeah, but that's fine. So I think that's actually kind of interesting, right? So people kind of agree on what is a good company, but then yet they ending up with totally different companies. So they don't actually agree, right? So then in the actual investment process, there's all kind of individual preferences for what makes a company attractive from an investing perspective or not, right? So they actually don't agree. So there must be some, who knows who's right? Like, I'm not saying misconceptions, but diverging views on what's a great company. And I think, for example, like the longest chapter in the book is about network effects, and probably because that's kind of where I have most personal experience, right? And I just see a lot of people talking about network effects, and when you hear these investing podcasts or you see some write-ups or something, you see people sort of casually just mentioning it as if it was kind of just like a binary thing, like network effect, yes or no, okay, so check. Kind of like, okay, wait a minute. There's like all these determinants of what makes a network effect intense and what makes it durable. You can decompose it multiple times, and you can analyze empirically the determinants of that. It isn't just as simple as kind of yes or no, check box, check, move on to self-verification of my pre-existing investment hypothesis. It's not that simple. That said, though, I think there might be some people who will criticize my book for saying, well, aren't there some investors who are so good at pattern recognition that they can kind of a priori, by their own thinking, kind of identify? And, actually, I think there is probably people like that, but I bet you it's not you. And it's not me. So I think for most people, except for maybe some kind of super genius like Warren Buffett, I think most people are well served by doing a lot of this empirical work.
You have a whole section about passion in your book. Why is passion important for great companies?
So I think it depends a lot on your investment hypothesis, sort of on your investment time horizon. If your time horizon is 1 to 3 years, then I don't think passion matters at all, really. But if you're like me, if you're more long term, so I don't have really any proof to back this up, and it's actually based a little bit on you could say anecdotal evidence. But if you look at the really, like maybe I can inject something. Sorry if I'm answering it. Is it okay? It will be a little bit longer answer. So I don't know if people listening this, if they're familiar with the economist Henrik Bessembinder, who made some studies on the statistical distribution of shareholder wealth creation. Maybe you can link to maybe some of his articles, but he basically found that if you look at from 1926 to today, if you kind of just bought the entire market, and every time there was a new company, you bought it and you hold it, you hold everything. So it's kind of a permanent buy and hold of the entire market. And then you look at over this time, over the sort of since 1926, how is the statistical distribution of wealth creation? You find that 60% of all stocks, they underperform T-bill during their lifetime. And the top 40, not top 40%, but top 40 stocks, they generated more than 40 or 50% of the entire shareholder wealth creation. If you then look at some of these companies, you look at some of these sort of 1,000 baggers, what kind of did they have in common? I think a lot of them had like really, really, really passionate management. They had really, really passionate management. And of course, there's a lot of survivorship bias in that. You can criticize me for making the argument and so on. But I just think so this is my belief. I cannot prove it. But my belief is that if you want to aim for kind of like power law distributed, like you know that the stock market is actually power law distributed if you're a buy and hold investor, similar to venture investing. And you're like, okay, so how can I increase the chances of hitting like a really crazy multi-bagger? I just postulate that I think passionate management is going to increase the likelihood of that. So that's why I focus a lot on it. But of course, if you have a different time horizon, I think it makes no sense to go through all this work of evaluating passion. It's kind of actually quite time consuming if you have to follow all these recipes. I think if you have a shorter time horizon, it's a total waste of time, because it's not going to matter. But I think, decisions, they kind of compound and accumulate, kind of like the same way as an investment can accumulate. I think decision on decision on decision on decision on decision accumulates. And if those people are really, really passionate, they are really, really perseverant, they really drive for the long term, they love what they do, they would do it even without the money, and so on and so on and so on. The people below them, they stay in the company, they have high retention, they communicate in a really crazy, authentic way, and so on and so on and so on, all of these determinants. Then I think you're much more, you're not sure, but you are more likely to hit the really long-term winners. And I think if you compare yourself to an index fund, an index fund is always exposed to the next 1,000 bagger. It's always exposed to the next 1,000 bagger. But you're not. Like in my concentrated portfolio, I'm not. I'm probably not, right? So I have a competitive disadvantage there. I am not exposed to the next 1,000 bagger. And I think at least by focusing on passionate people, maybe I make up a little bit for that.
So you mentioned the section on passion. Maybe as a small teaser to the book, what else is important to spot great companies aside from passion?
But I think, I think passion is maybe. So some of the other things on people is that I have a chapter on is long-term incentives, capital allocation, and reliability. But I think especially number 2 and 3 is probably already very well described and obvious to people. But I think reliability of communication is also maybe something where people don't think about to the same extent as me, or some people do, others may not. But I focus a lot on it. So in my analytical process, I kind of like to simulate having followed a company for a long time. So I like to go through and sort of chronologically read or listen to earnings calls and to whatever they have said in interviews and what they have written in the annual report and in shareholder letters and so on. And I think this is a great exercise to do, especially if you do it like in a compressed time frame, like over 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 days. you actually there's so many interesting byproducts that come out of this analysis. I know it sounds like, if you haven't tried it, maybe sounds silly, but just try to it once, you'll see it. Like, you, first of all, you get a pretty good idea about sort of did the predictions they made compare with the ex post outcomes. But you also get a very good chronological understanding of stuff, instead of just sort of a static view of today. And you get a surprisingly good understanding of the business also sometimes. So I think it has some interesting side effects in addition to just evaluating the reliability of because, like, the point, the justification for doing this is, when you make an investment in a company today, I'm talking about public and private. Like, my book is not limited to public companies, but so when you make an investment today in a company, how much of the information you are relying on does really originate from the current management? Well, one thing, you might have had some direct interactions with them, you might have not, so you might have just read what they have said and so on. But then if you rely on maybe some sell side stuff, that also originates from the management probably. If you rely on some kind of industry experts, maybe that also originates a little bit. Their opinion is also affected by what the management says, and so on and so on and so on. So I don't think you can, like, no matter which way you go, you're gonna end up relying on information that originates from them in how you build your investment thesis. Well, then it's pretty important, I think, to have an idea about how reliable has that been in the past. But of course, just because it has been reliable doesn't prove that it will be true. But I mean, it's just an important input. So what else? I mean, I have like, I think also something that maybe is not so much described, but I already mentioned it before, is the stuff with competitive advantages. I see a lot of people, they always talk about, if you hear like investment podcast, investment books, they always talk about, so what's the competitive advantage? So all these companies you hear about, they all have a competitive advantage. But then you never hear about some companies have a competitive disadvantage. So that's weird, right? So if you have like, there's something wrong sort of statistically. If all these companies on these podcasts, whatever, have competitive advantages, then there must be like 10 times as many companies with competitive disadvantages. Why are they never described on the podcast or on the, right? It doesn't make sense. So all companies have some form of competitive disadvantages. Seemingly, I don't know why I never hear about people talking about competitive disadvantages. There are people always talk about competitive advantages. I have some stuff in the book about that. I actually had a specific chapter on that I had to delete because I thought I got this sort of middle part it got very technical, and I didn't want to lose people because I think part 3 of the book is actually the best. So I didn't want to have people sort of drop off because it got a little bit too technical. But I still think you can just invert and just use these frameworks to evaluate disadvantages as well. And then, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't want to go through all the chapters.
It's fine. You teased a lot, and people can read the book via the link below. They also can buy it, and we also linked the Bessenbinder studies, so people can also have a look at them. For the end of the interview, I want to look at you and how your transformation you had done with the book. So, how did writing the book change you?
Well, I think there were two. We can talk about 2 dimensions of change. So I think for me, it was very frightening to start adding the humor to it. Like it was like a mental journey. So I had, just for context, in about October 2023, I had written the first draft of the book. I had the whole full book, no jokes, no humor, a little bit of sort of subconscious analogies here and there. I hadn't thought about it. One guy, he mentioned to me, he's a professor at the Copenhagen Business School, he mentioned to me, this book is so dry, I don't recognize your personality. I started adding a little bit to it, and it felt sort of, I don't know, it felt really weird. I thought, can I put this out there? It will be so embarrassing. I have all these professional investors looking at this fool with these silly jokes. And then the next reviewer who read it, they liked it. So like I add a little bit more, and this journey, and then at some point I just kind of got over the hill, and I was like, okay, screw it. Screw it. I'll just be like 100% myself, and I won't care what people think. And it was great because I had this secret dream of writing also kind of a comedy book and comedy novel or something. So I kind of just married those 2 ideas, and I think that was like beautiful, and it gave me like so much satisfaction. So that's the one answer. But I also think like on the you internalize. This is something I probably already knew, but I know it much more now. By writing down something, you really internalize something. So by writing down this book, I had this framework already. I knew exactly the chapters, how they were gonna be structured when I started writing, but I just really internalized in a totally different way in respect to my own research. And what I actually discovered is now when I do research, I really like to write these crazy kind of like very draft kind of. It's not a write-up, but it's like I take these structured notes. I don't even make an attempt to make it nice. I don't want anybody to ever read them, but I only write them with the intention of internalizing information so that it sticks in my head more. And I discovered that through writing the book also. I think that was, and probably everybody who wrote a book probably discovered the same, I presume. But it was something that was quite interesting to discover. And so I have for sure internalized this framework much more than I had before I wrote the book.
Would you recommend other investors to also write a book?
Yes, but I would say so. If you look at my personal, journey, I had started writing the book in January 2023. I quit my job in Novo Holdings and had the last day in September. And I thought I had written most of the book and completed most of the book, but I totally underestimated it. So I was actually quite lucky that when I wanted to start my own, because I also started my own investment firm, I had to wait quite a long time for the regulatory license, and that actually turned out to be quite lucky for me, because then I had more time to make the book really, really good. But I also just discovered how big a distraction how much time it actually took from having written that first draft to editing it over and over again. Like I went through every single sentence, and how big a distraction that can be. So if you like run a fund or something and you want to write a book, I mean, I will probably not write a book again unless it's kind of like some kind of natural byproduct of the stuff that I'm already writing that I can publish in some form or the other. Like it's very time consuming, but I think it was a great experience. But it kind of depends if you can justify the distraction it's going to be, because it's probably going to be to me at least, it felt like over the winter like a big distraction compared to the fact that I was also going to start an investment firm. But I had underestimated how long time it would take from writing the first draft to finishing it totally.
That's a normal mistake you do when you start something. It always takes way longer and is more painful. Yay! So for the end of our interview, I always want to give my guests the chance to add anything we haven't discussed. So is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, maybe I would like to also recommend a few other books, actually. So I think if you kind of criticize my book for being kind of too checklisty, I think it would be interesting for you to read the book called The Checklist Manifesto. I think you will have a different view on sort of the process of checklists. There's another book that it's actually not recommended in my book, but I think is quite useful. It's the book called Factfulness by Hans Rosling. He talked a lot about this thing called the gap instinct. And I think this actually aligns very well with the kind of thinking that I satirize so much in my book. But these are not investing books. These are just like other kinds of book. But I think they have some interesting aspects, both that I think parallel my book in some way that I think they would complement my book in a good way. I mean, I'm not trying to compare myself to these books. They are like crazy bestsellers, right? But I think that if they would complement my book in an interesting way. I think if you disagree with me after reading my book, you should maybe read those two books.
Then thank you very much for this edition. I will link them below for people that they can find them to buy. And Simon, thank you very much for our interview and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much, Tilman.
And bye-bye to the audience. Bye-bye. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please leave a like and a comment, and for sure subscribe to my channel. Traditionally, I want to close this conversation with the disclaimer. So here you can find the disclaimer. It says, Please do your own work. This is no recommendation. What we are doing here is just a qualified talk that helps you, but it's no recommendation. Please always do your own work. Thank you and hope to see you in the next episode. Bye bye.